So my name is Omer. I'm going to talk about the impossibility of obfuscation with auxiliary input or universal simulator. And as you said, this is a joint work with Nir, Ran, Henry, Shafi, Yael, and Alon. Okay, so the task of program obfuscation is to write programs in a way that hides their secret implementation details. So obfuscation is an extremely useful notion. We can use it to protect software from reverse engineering. And obfuscation also has many other cryptographic applications. So one classic example that was suggested already by Diffie and Hellman is how to turn private key encryption into public key encryption. So consider an encryption algorithm for some symmetric encryption scheme. So this algorithm takes a secret encryption key. And now we can obfuscate this algorithm such that it can still be used to encrypt. But other than that, the obfuscation completely hides the secret key, and no one can use it to decrypt or for any other purpose. So ideally, what we want is an obfuscation that hides everything about the program except for its input-output behavior. And I'll give a formal definition of this in a few slides. So today, we don't know much about the achievability of such ideal obfuscation. On the positive side, we know that based on strong assumptions, some very simple functions such as point functions do have ideal obfuscation. On the negative side, we have contrived examples of functions that cannot be ideally obfuscated. But for most functions, getting ideal obfuscation is still an open question. So for many years, we really didn't have any construction of obfuscation, not even heuristic ones, for any function outside this green region. So the common belief was that obfuscation is probably impossible for most functions. Until last year, when a surprising result of Garg et al. Constructed the first candidate obfuscation for all circuits. So maybe the picture should look more like this. It could be that, except for a small set of contrived unobfuscatable functions, the construction of Garg et al. Is ideally secure for all other functions. So today I'll tell you about a new impossibility result for ideal obfuscation. So in a very high and non-technical level, we show that under some computational assumptions, a natural notion of ideal obfuscation is impossible to achieve for a large family of cryptographic functionalities. So essentially, we show that the picture should look something like this. So next, I'll give you some formal definition to replace these highlighted informal terms. And let me just mention that our result is a strengthening of a previous result by Goldwasser and Kalai. And I'll compare these two results a bit later in the talk. OK, so let's start by defining the natural notion of ideal obfuscation that we're going to work with. So we'll work with a notion of Barak et al. Called virtual black box obfuscation, or VBB. And the intuition here is that an obfuscated program should be exactly as useful as a black box that computes the program for you. Formally, we say that an algorithm O is a VBB obfuscator for a class of programs if for every efficient adversary, there exists an efficient simulator such that for every program in the class and for every predicate of this program, whenever an adversary can learn the predicate from the obfuscated program, the simulator can learn the same predicate given only black box access to the program. So this definition really captures our intuition of ideal obfuscation. But one weakness of this definition is that it only tells us that for every adversary there exists a simulator. It doesn't give us any efficient way to go from an adversary to the simulator. So to see why this is important, let's talk about how we actually use VBB obfuscation in applications. So imagine that you want to use VBB obfuscation to construct some cryptographic scheme, and you want to prove that your scheme is secure. So what you should do is design a reduction that takes any adversary that can break the security of your scheme and use it to solve some hard problem. Now, since your scheme is based on VBB obfuscation, then at some point, this reduction must use the fact that for this adversary, there exists a corresponding simulator. Now, since the transformation from the adversary to the simulator may be inefficient, then even if you have the adversary in your hand, you may not know how the corresponding simulator should look like. So now it's as if you have this kind of missing piece in your reduction. So we know that there exists a simulator that can be used to fill the gap in this reduction. We just have no idea how to find it. So one way to get around this limitation is to consider what we call VBB obfuscation with a universal simulator. So this definition is very similar to the previous definition of VBB, except that now the order of quantifiers is switched. Now we require that there is a single universal simulator that can simulate the output of any adversary when we give it as input the code of this adversary. So essentially, we can think about this universal simulator as giving us an efficient transformation from an adversary to its simulator. So let me just stress that we do not restrict the simulator to use the adversary as a black box. We explicitly give the simulator the code of the adversary. So universal simulation is really the natural notion of simulation that we consider also in other places in cryptography, like zero knowledge or multi-party computation. So specifically, black box simulators, simulators that only use the adversary as a black box, are a special case of universal simulators. And moreover, even the few non-black box simulators that we have, like Barak's zero knowledge simulator, are also universal. OK, so going back to our result, we show that VBB obfuscation with a universal simulator cannot be achieved for a large family of cryptographic functionalities. So let me specify what are these cryptographic functionalities. So we'll consider families of functions that are pseudo-entropic. So these are functions that can be used to generate a lot of pseudo-entropy. Formally, we say that a family of functions has super-polynomial pseudo-entropy if there exists a set of inputs, I, such that for a random function in the family, the output of the function on inputs from the set I are computationally indistinguishable from a random variable z that really has super polynomial mean entropy. So a bit more precisely, we require that an efficient distinguisher that gets oracle access to the truth table of the function cannot distinguish between the real function and a function where the outputs on the set I are replaced by a random sample from z. OK, so let me give some examples of pseudo-entropic functions. So first of all, any family of pseudo-random function is also pseudo-entropic. But actually, the class of pseudo-entropic function is much wider. For example, any encryption function, when we think about it as a deterministic function of the message that's deriving its randomness by applying a pseudo-random function on the message, will be pseudo-entropic. And this is exactly the type of functions that we often want to obfuscate, for example, when turning private key encryption into public key encryption. OK, so now the last unspecified part of our result is the assumption. So if you haven't seen this before, this may sound a bit counterintuitive. But to get our impossibility results for obfuscation, we actually rely on an obfuscation assumption. But we're going to assume a much weaker type of obfuscation than virtual black box. Specifically, we'll work with the notion of Barak et al. Called indistinguishability obfuscation. So the security requirement for indistinguishability obfuscation is that for every pair of equivalent circuits, circuits of the same size that compute exactly the same function, their obfuscations should be computationally indistinguishable from each other. So now our assumption is that indistinguishability obfuscation exists for all circuits. And it's important to note that for indistinguishability obfuscation, we don't have any impossibility results. And in fact, we conjecture that the construction of Garg et al. Is a good candidate to satisfy this assumption. OK, so finally, our complete result is that assuming indistinguishability obfuscation, VBB obfuscation with a universal simulator is impossible for any pseudo-entropic function. OK, so this result can actually be separated into two results, one for average-case VBB and one for worst-case VBB. So worst-case VBB is the definition that we just saw earlier, when we require security for every single function in our family. And in average-case VBB, we only require security for a randomly chosen function from the family. So in both cases, we get an impossibility for all pseudo-entropic functions, but based on slightly different assumptions. So for average-case VBB, we rely on indistinguishability obfuscation for all functions. And for worst-case VBB, we also rely on indistinguishability obfuscation, but only for a specific family of functions called point filter functions. So if you're familiar with the notion of witness encryption, then witness encryption is equivalent to indistinguishability obfuscation for point filter functions. So I want to note that average-case VBB is weaker than worst-case VBB, so getting a negative result for average-case VBB is more difficult. And it's also much more meaningful, Because in applications, when we obfuscate pseudo-entropic functions, we almost always obfuscate a random function from the family. So we're really mostly interested in average case obfuscation. OK, so as I said before, this result is a strengthening of a previous result by Goldwasser and Kalai. So let me quickly compare the two results. So in the case of average-case VBB, the work of Goldwasser and Kalai is getting an impossibility for a much more restricted set of functions called filter functions. And their result is unconditional. In this work, we show that assuming indistinguishability of obfuscation, the result of Goldwasser and Kalai can be extended to all pseudo-entropic functions. For worst-case VBB, both results are for pseudo-entropic functions, but the work of Goldwasser and Kalai is relying on stronger assumptions. Specifically, they use VBB obfuscation for point filter function, where we only need indistinguishability obfuscation. So again, using the terminology of witness encryption, this is like the difference between extractable witness encryption and plain witness encryption. So the work of Goldwasser and Kalai was originally talking about a notion called obfuscation with auxiliary input, not about universal simulation. So in this work, we show an equivalence between these two notions. And this gives us kind of an alternative way to look at our result using the language of auxiliary input. So the definition of obfuscation with auxiliary input is very similar to the original definition of VBB that we saw, where there's a different simulator for every adversary. Except that now we also give our adversary an arbitrary auxiliary input string, z, and we also give the same auxiliary inputs to the simulator. So we show that VBB obfuscation with auxiliary input is equivalent to VBB with a universal simulator. And such an equivalence between universal simulation and auxiliary input simulation was already observed also in other contexts, for example, by Goldreich in the context of zero knowledge. So the idea here is very similar. The idea is to consider the universal adversary, an adversary that just gets a description of a circuit as auxiliary input and just emulates it. And now the simulator for this universal adversary will be our universal simulator. We can use it to simulate the output of any adversary by encoding the adversary as auxiliary input to the universal simulator. So this equivalence can also be separated into two results, one for average-case VBB and one for worst-case VBB. So we show that So we show that average-case VBB with a universal simulator is equivalent to average-case VBB with auxiliary input that is independent of the function. That is, we first fix some arbitrary auxiliary input string, and only then we sample a random function from the family. For worst-case VBB, we show that the universal simulator is equivalent to auxiliary input that may depend on the obfuscated function. OK. OK, so let me tell you about the proof of our impossibility result. So to get an impossibility result for VBB obfuscation, we need to find something that the adversary can do with an obfuscated pseudo-entropic function that the simulator cannot do given only oracle access to such a function. So the idea that was already used by Goldwasser and Kalai is that the simulator should not be able to find a small circuit that computes the pseudo-entropic function, but the adversary can always find such a circuit. It's just the obfuscation itself. Now, if you remember, in the definition of VBB obfuscation, we require that the adversary only outputs a single bit of information about the obfuscated program. So really, the main technical challenge in the proof will be to design an adversary that can somehow convert any circuit that computes the function into a single bit of information. OK, so let's start with the impossibility for worst-case VBB. And for simplicity, let's consider a family of pseudo-random function. The arguments for general pseudo-entropic function will be very similar. Let's fix a simulator S and sample a random function from the family fk. And now we'll construct an adversary that will depend on the key k that can fail the simulator S. So since our adversary will only work for a single function in the family, we only get an impossibility for worst-case VBB. So we also consider an arbitrary set of inputs, I, that is much larger than the size of the obfuscated program. For example, the inputs 1, 2, 3 until twice the size of the obfuscated program. So now our adversary will have hard-coded to it a bit b, and also the truth table of the function fk on inputs from the set I. So what the adversary does is, when given an input circuit C, it first verifies that C is really a circuit of the same size as the obfuscation of fk, and that it computes the same function of fk on the inputs from I. So if this is the case, the adversary outputs the secret bit b, otherwise it outputs bottom. So we can see that when we run this adversary on a real obfuscation of fk, we get out the secret bit. So the simulator should be able to output the same bit, given only the code of this adversary and oracle access to the function fk. Now, maybe the simulator can't find a small circuit that computes fk, but it doesn't really need to, because the bit b is just hard-coded into the adversary. The simulator can just read it and output it. So the idea will be to give the simulator the adversary when it's obfuscated using indistinguishability obfuscation in a way that hides the bit b. So here we really use the fact that the simulator is universal and efficient. First we fix the simulator, only then we give it a random obfuscation of the adversary, and now the simulator really cannot break the obfuscation. So the last thing we need to do is to show that an obfuscated adversary really hides the bit from the simulator. So first of all, since fk is a pseudo-random function, we should not be able to distinguish an adversary that contains the real truth table of fk from an adversary that contains a truth table of a truly random function. And now, since the set I is very large, much larger than the size of the obfuscation, then with overwhelming probability, there is no small circuit of the same size as the obfuscation that agrees with this random truth table. So this adversary will never output the bit b. In fact, it's functionally equivalent to an adversary that just always outputs bottom. So now from the security of indistinguishability obfuscation, we get that obfuscations of these three adversaries are all indistinguishable. And since this last adversary is independent of the bit b, then the obfuscation of the original adversary should also hide the bit b. So this was the impossibility for worst-case VBB. To get an impossibility for average-case VBB, we'll need to design an adversary that is independent of any specific function fk. So if before we hard-coded into the adversary the truth table of fk, and we had the adversary output the bit b on an input circuit that agrees with this correct truth table, the idea now is to define the bit b to be a pseudo-random function of the truth table. So the adversary will have some pseudo-random function hard-coded to it. This pseudo-random function has nothing to do with the function fk that we're proving an impossibility for. It's going to get an input circuit C, compute its truth table, and apply the pseudo-random function on this truth table. So now we have that if the input circuit C has a different truth table than fk, then the output of the adversary on C will look completely random and independent of the output of the adversary on an obfuscation of fk. So the main step of the proof that I will not have time to talk about today is to show that an indistinguishability obfuscation of the adversary really hides the value of the pseudo-random function on the real truth table. And to do this, we use a tool called puncturable PRFs. The idea is to show that if the truth table of fk was truly random, we could puncture this PRF on an input that encodes this truth table without changing the functionality of the adversary. So this is all I wanted to tell you about, and thank you very much for your attention.